Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 14 of Unfair and Unbalanced, a podcast with Roy Snell and Tom Fox. I am the compliance evangelist, and Roy Snell is, of course, the president of the SCCE. And this is the podcast where we take a look at the compliance profession in a wide-ranging approach. In this episode, we tackle three topics. The first is the penalty assessed by the NCAA for Notre Dame in their self-disclosure of utilizing two ineligible football players in a couple of seasons, I think 2012 and 2013. We then take I advocate that employees should not put stupid stuff in emails, and we discussed in the context of forced transparency and the hyper-transparency of today's corporate life. And finally, we end with how the safety industry 20 years ago really expanded and is a roadmap for what the compliance industry is going through now in terms of its growth, maturity, and sophistication. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Unfair and Unbalanced. You have been thinking about a recent event that happened to the Notre Dame football team. And that event was Notre Dame was sanctioned to the point where they were instructed by the NCAA to forfeit 2 years of wins, 2 seasons worth of wins for using ineligible players. Why don't you kind of lay out, as you understand it, what happened and see where we might go with this?
So I'm driving to work, and I'm listening to Mike and Mike in the morning. And one of these, it doesn't matter, anybody understands who these guys are, but one of them's a former Notre Dame football player, and his son played for Notre Dame. He's a Notre Dame homer. The other guy, the other Mike's been working with him for years, kind of a homer for Mike. And they were saying this thing happened in Notre Dame. They had a problem. They found the problem. They fixed the problem. They undid the grades. They found out the kids cheated on some papers and tests. They took back the grades that they stole, essentially. They suspended the players immediately. I believe they dismissed some person who was helping the kids write the papers or whatever. This is the usual story. And turned themselves into the NCAA, and the NCAA says, thank you very much, and by the way, we're going to negate all of the games from the record books for 2 years, one of which is one of their best years ever. Finished second in the country, I believe. And the point that the Mike and Mike were making is this is horrible. They did exactly what they were asking, and they got punished terribly. I was outraged. I came into work. I started to write my article on how unfair this is. Here it is. We're getting people to implement compliance and ethics programs, have discipline, investigate, do the whole thing, and take care of the problem yourself, and they're being punished. Well, before I wrote, I had to read some more. I happened to read what the NCAA said. And the NCAA basically said, we're sorry, but they played people who were ineligible, or they were on the bench, they were on the field, they could have gone into the game, they did go into the game, who knows? I don't know. But they said, because you stole those games with ineligible people, you have to give the games back. And I kind of thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, the university knew they should give the grades back. Kids stole the grades. The university said, you can't have those grades. You stole those grades. So they changed the grades because they stole the grades. Now, they had a bunch of wins that year. Nobody's ever going to know how much these kids had an impact on that. There's just no way to ever figure that out. You played ineligible players, the NCAA said. And you stole the games, and we got to get back the games. And I thought, how is this different from stealing the grades? And I couldn't. I don't remember what I did. I might have written this up, but I couldn't.
Couldn't decide.
Say that again, Tom.
You wrote it that you couldn't decide.
Yeah.
You were of two.
Well, I'm stuck. I'm really stuck. I think essentially the short answer is the NCAA said thank you very much, but you didn't have adequate punishment. Where are you at on this? Help me out here.
Yeah, full disclosure, whoever plays Notre Dame each week is one of my favorite teams. So, I went to 3 universities that Notre Dame has kicked for 40 or 50 years, so I'm not a big Notre Dame fan. So you have to I've gone around and round on this one, and part of me says I can't say anything that would put Notre Dame in a positive light. But you have suggested that I have to put my prejudices aside and evaluate this as a professional. So but I do have to evaluate this as a lawyer, Roy. And a lawyer's analysis would be, or my lawyer's analysis, I would say, is that if they violated NCAA rules, and if the punishment specifies that games will be forfeited where ineligible players played, then if that appears to be a severe penalty, so be it. I don't know if the NCAA has discretion on this. The NCAA enforcement organization, I think, is pretty widely viewed as ineffective and inconsistent. So if part of this was they were trying to make a statement that they were going to punish a major university, they certainly made that statement. But if the precedent would show this was done on this punishment was levied on a regular basis, yeah, it's severe, but you broke the rules, and that's the sanction against you. On the other hand, if there is room in the regulations for discretion, if you have a situation where a company, here a university, detects a violation, then moves to remediate that violation, moves to disclose to the appropriate regulatory authorities that violation, and then puts systems, policies, and procedures in place to prevent and or detect it going forward, I think that should be considered too. So what I don't know is the players have not been identified for, I guess, privacy reasons. So we don't know who they were. We don't know whether they were on the team, whether they played, what the situation was. The newspaper accounts I've read, I have not read any of the underlying source documents, but the newspaper accounts said that Notre Dame, the head coach, knew nothing about this. It was a student manager who was writing papers for 2 students to keep them eligible. The coaching staff didn't know about it. The athletic director didn't know about it. You might ask why there were not detection procedures in place that would have picked this up earlier. Certainly when grades are given out, you would know around that time if somebody's grades bumped up. But I don't think I really have a good enough understanding of the facts and the law to really give an opinion one way or the other. But if there was discretion available to the NCAA and the sentence, then this would appear to be a very harsh sentence. If this was,
I think that's a great point, Tom. Is there, and this is what the U.S. Sentencing Commission essentially did. They said there's a gradation of penalty based on your effort. The NCAA is not adopting that philosophy. Based on the facts that you just outlined, we don't know the answers to necessarily, but they're all the right questions. Who knew what, when, and how many players, and what impact did they likely have, and how hard did this school try to find this problem? Did they find it? Did they fix it? Did they bring it to our attention? Was there a disclosure? I mean, you can't score much higher than Notre Dame did on the old credibility meter of compliance and ethics. You just can't do much better than they did, except for a bigger sanction on yourself. Like they said, let's vacate 2 years of our scores. Obviously, Notre Dame thinks that's too much. So you're right. This is what the NCAA should build into their system. some sort of, whether it's arbitrary or specific as possible, here's the range of penalties for each of the infractions, from kind of tiny to very big for flagrant stuff. So in this case, the question I would have is if they had a school play with ineligible players, a couple of them like this, similar story, but they didn't find it, they didn't fix it, somebody else found it, and the NCAA had to decide. And they gave that school the same penalty, 2 years of pulling their records out of the books, then that's a crime. There's absolutely no recognition of people doing the things the way we all want them to do. So I guess the real question here, I would have for the NCAA, would you do the same thing for a school that did the same thing but didn't, that maybe even found it and refused to fix it? Somebody else reported them, and it wasn't handled the right way at all. And if they would treat them both the same way, then I say the NCAA, your system is broken. You are not motivating people to prevent, find, and fix problems. As a matter of fact, you're telling people whether we find it or you find it, you're going to get the same penalty. Who the heck would bother finding and fixing problems?
So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see, perhaps when more comes out, either.
Yeah, there'll be there's an appeal, I believe. I don't think that's been decided yet.
So, Roy, I wanted to end up our time kind of throwing out a question around a phrase I've heard you use called forced transparency.
Oh, yeah.
But that's from 2016. I would throw in the Panama Papers. I would throw in the hacking around the election. I would throw around misinformation, disinformation, fake news. But one thing that I've observed for corporations is hyper-transparency. So what does all this mean to you, and where do you think compliance fits into this?
So it's just a general observation. I have a 65,000-foot view of planet Earth. Is that there's this hue and cry for transparency. And there's some extremists who want every bit and byte on the hard drive or in the files of any company or government to be publicly available. And I think that's obviously, well, not obviously, but I believe that's extreme and probably not necessary and got a lot of problems. And you have people who maybe are on the other side. But for years, people like Transparency International and others have been trying to get governments and companies to disclose more about who they are and what they do and how they do it. And the world is just creaking along with little improvements every year or 10 years to this transparency thing. 1,000 years ago, the amount of transparency that came out of governments was not much. There's some countries where there's a lot more transparency now, but it's not satisfied the extremists. Well, enter hackers that have taken out certain companies. One I don't think you mentioned would be Sony, and basically taken everything off their hard drive and put it in the public domain. Can you imagine being a law firm and 20 years of your client's information being dumped into the street? Well, I'm thinking about, and by the way, I'm against it. Hacking is bad. Privacy rights are important. Some transparency is good. Total transparency in the case of the Panama Papers meant that people's private information was publicly made available. That's wrong. Okay, so, but I'm not into right or wrong right at the moment. What I'm into is what is the impact of Sony, Panama Papers, and the political hacking mean to the world? The whole world. Well, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world within the next week deleted a sentence in an email that they otherwise would have sent if Sony, Panama Papers, and the political hacking didn't occur. Whole emails probably weren't sent. Whole documents were probably not created by the thousands, tens of thousands. And one positive spin, whether I'm not saying that's right or wrong or good or bad or interesting or not interesting. All I'm saying is people always run lying, cheating, and stealing through a filter or two. One filter is, will I get caught? Prior to the hacking, concern about getting caught was probably, let's say, a 3. After the hacking, whether it was real or not, some people bounced right up to a 9. I'm not going to do that bad thing now, because what if the files of an entire system are compromised and dumped into the public? My odds of getting caught went up. Everybody in the world felt like their odds of getting caught cheating, lying, cheating, stealing, went up. Whether it was 1% or 10% or 50% or 100%, it changed. And every hack from here on out of a governmental agency or a political office or a law firm or a company of any kind is going to cause that percentage to go up. People will take fewer risks because their thoughts that they can hide in a computer or their emails were safe or their documents were safe is being eroded. And I just don't think people are noticing. They talk about the right or wrong and Panama and hackers are terrible and all the information should be disclosed so the hackers are all good. I don't care to get in that conversation. They're missing the point. The world's never going to be the same, and some good things are probably going to come from it. I hate to say that because I don't want to imply I'm for it. I'm not for it. Nobody should hack anybody, and privacy is an important law.
So the first thing I would observe, Roy, is something that I routinely put on training for, which is don't say stupid things in emails. And I'm a huge believer in that because as a recovering trial lawyer, I had to defend lots of corporations where people put incredibly stupid stuff in emails. So I think in large part that if people don't put stupid stuff in emails, they'll alleviate a big part of the problem. But perhaps that view is more naive after we've seen the effects of the alleged Russian hacking scandal of the Democratic Party over the past presidential election cycle, and that if there has been a change, there will be a change, and there will be a response, and there will be a response that business can work with. And whether that response is, heaven forbid, we go back to pen and paper, maybe that's a response, but maybe there are technological responses. But the salacious things we read in the Sony emails, the hypocritical or inane things we read in the hacks of John Podesta's emails, my answer to that is don't put that kind of stuff in emails. If you talk about your sex life, don't put it in an email. If you want to say that somebody is you name the word, don't put it in an email. It doesn't mean you can't think of them that way or that you can't have that conversation with somebody. But once you commit something to paper, it is in the world and it's going to get out. And so when the president of Sony says, well, I was embarrassed that part of, stories about my sex life got it. Well, honey, don't put it in an email to a friend. So, as you might say, I don't have a lot of sympathy for some of those. There are, I think, more troubling questions about misinformation and disinformation. But I'm going to flip back to what that guy who is the president of the German Manufacturers Association said. Compliance is the answer. Part of compliance is transparency. And the compliance part is we have a process which is dedicated to preventing illegal and unethical conduct. If it occurs, we detect it. And if we detect it, we remediate it or we fix it. Yeah. And when you can show that to a representative of the press, a representative of the public, or of our government, I think that's the response as a corporation. So, I mean, I would tie it back to compliance, and compliance is the key, and compliance is the answer. And it ties back into many of the concepts we've talked about so far in this podcast. But, putting stupid stuff in emails, don't do it.
Yeah. You know what? You make me think of something really interesting. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can't believe I did anything for 20 years. I got ADD and all kinds of reasons why I can't believe I'm kind of in the same place for this long. But it'll make it interesting 20 years from now. I'm going to listen to the Bob and Sam podcast because Tom and Roy won't be doing them anymore. And they're going to be discussing some stuff that is completely unrelated. Or maybe they listen to this one 20 years from now, which would be 36. Holy crikey, man. 2036, we're going to be sitting in our rocking chairs listening to somebody discuss a 20-year-old podcast about the future and the current events, and they're going to say stuff, I'll bet you, that I can't believe those guys had to deal with that back in the day. Because it's very possible 20 years from now that people will do a lot better job of saying and doing the right thing, and certainly there may be a greater acceptance and support of compliance at the C-suite and board level. And I really wonder if people listening to this 20 years from now would say, I can't believe those guys were worried about that crud. We don't have those problems. Probably have a whole new set of concerns. But I have a hunch that I got to tell you, when I was a compliance officer 20 years ago, I mean, there wasn't very many in the whole country, and not full-fledged compliance. There's all kinds of people claim they were in compliance because they were in risk, or they were in compliance because they were in ethics, or they were in compliance because they were in law. But a fully functioning 7-element compliance program, there wasn't too many. And we literally went to conferences with our hands over our badges on occasion. We took them off because there were enforcement folks there. We didn't want to draw attention. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was just a very unnerving time. Everybody was concerned about getting investigated and drawing attention to themselves and whatever. And now we'd laugh about it. Well, what are they going to be laughing about 20 years from now? Probably all the stuff we're talking about, although we're really serious and we really mean it and we're really concerned. I wonder how much of this will be just gone shortly.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Unfair and Unbalanced, a podcast with Roy Snell and Tom Fox, where we take a look at the compliance profession. I have 2 requests of you. The first is, if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, if you could rate this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. It would help our rankings. The second thing is, Roy and I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions you'd like us to explore in a mailbag episode, please email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com or Roy Snell at roy.snell@scce.org. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Unfair and Unbalanced.